Hi guys, and welcome to this video. I hope you're all doing super well. Thank you so much once again for joining me right here on my channel. So today guys, I am going to be discussing another Jewish cult, and this cult by any terms is a very prolific cult. I'd say out of the different Jewish cults or sects that exist, this one actually I would say is probably the most prolific. So let's get into the video. So the cult we're going to be discussing today guys is called Lev Tahor. Lev Tahor in Hebrew or Yiddish means pure hearts basically, which is very interesting considering what goes on in this cult. So yeah, and Lev Tahor, as I was just mentioning, are very prolific. And they have been located across quite a number of countries as well. So to start with, Lev Tahor was founded by Shlomo Helbrans, and Shlomo Helbrans is actually a Jew of Kurdish descent. His parents were actually Kurdish Jews, and they actually came from a secular background. So essentially they were not what I would refer to as practicing Jews. They would do like the main holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Purim and things like that, but they weren't like what I refer to as practicing Jews. So Shlomo Helbrans was from Jerusalem in Israel, and he didn't really become more of what I call, extremist and fundamentalist until he hit around the age of 13. And for Jews, 13 is quite an important age because that's when boys do their bar mitzvah, which is sort of the passing from teenagehood to or being a child to more of a man. So it's quite an important step within Judaism and the Jewish life culturally as well. And from this point, this is where he started to become more radicalized and have a very different perception of the Torah and what Judaism is, and also what halakha law is, which is essentially Jewish law. Shlomo Helbrans got married when he was 17 to his wife Malka, so he was extremely young and so was she, and it is known that years later she actually escaped of her own free will from the cult because she was severely abused and beaten within this cult, and she then went on to speak out about them. So they had two daughters together. One was called Sarah and the other was called Miriam. So Sarah, she ended up being excommunicated from the cult because she didn't agree with what they were doing, so they excommunicated her. And the other sister, Miriam, I actually remember seeing this guys in documentaries, and it's really sad. So basically Miriam had an allergy to certain different foods, and one of her allergies was to sesame seeds or sesame. And basically one of the elder kind of members of this cult forced her to eat some bread with sesame on, knowing that Miriam was allergic to sesame. And yeah, Miriam ended up passing away when this clearly could have been prevented because they forced her to eat this, and they had this perception that her having an allergy is actually nonsense and she should just consume whatever they give her to consume, which is ridiculous, and she died. So that's kind of sort of the surrounding of Shlomo Helbrans' immediate family. Now, he founded this cult in 1988, and he developed a sort of radicalized version of what halakha law is, or Jewish law in the Torah. So what that entailed from his perspective is that women and very small young girls should wear this kind of black burqa cloth and be fully covered, and even children from a very young age should be fully covered. So it is in a sort of how can I say this, from a clothing aspect, it sounds very similar to the Haredi burqa sect, but their processes in Lev Tahor are a bit different. So yeah, they had again a very sort of extreme version of what modesty entails in the Torah. And again guys, I've said this in I think my previous video as well, that this way of dressing is not what is stated in the Torah. It's what they what Shlomo Helbrans developed, basically. Yeah, they also had a very sort of extremist view of what the laws of kashrut, or keeping kosher, is in Judaism, and they believed that everything that they eat should really be made by them, so they shouldn't really be purchasing anything from a store, for example, or a supermarket, even if it's kosher approved by the Bet Din, which is the Jewish law court for us as Jews. They still wouldn't purchase it. They believe that everything has to be made by them, because else it's not kosher enough, basically. So this cult has been across many different countries, and I'll explain why, because it didn't start out like that, and it wasn't planned initially, I think, for them to be spread over so many countries, but it ended up being like that for very specific reasons. And they have been present in Romania, Macedonia, Mexico, Guatemala, Canada, United States, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro, and Israel. I don't know if I mentioned Israel, but Israel as well. And yeah, basically it didn't start out where they had this sort of plan to be in as many countries, but because of different situations that arose, they ended up being present in all of these different countries. And a lot of these countries, I'd say, aside from Israel and the US, most of these other countries don't have what I call a substantial Jewish community in them, but they ended up having to go to these countries. Things that this cult, guys, have been prolific for are quite extreme. So there has been abuse towards children, the use of drugs as well, which for any other Jewish denomination, or sect or cult, this is not something that I've come across before, but this cult was using illicit substances as well, and they were ensuring that forced marriages were done for very young girls, and these girls were sometimes as young as 14 or 15 years old, and they were forced to marry men who were 20 years older than them. So that's like a 14-year-old marrying a 34-year-old, which is just absolutely disgusting and crazy. Now obviously everything I'm mentioning it's Shlomo Helbrans that's put this in place, and I think I mentioned this before on my channel, guys, that often these cult leaders are people that have trained at top yeshivas in Israel or other countries, but more often than not Israel. And the yeshiva is a religious study school for boys or men, and they study the Torah and religious Jewish books for years and years and years, so that they know these books inside out. And Shlomo Helbrans is one of these people that he became so prolific because he developed so much knowledge of all these different religious books in Judaism, and then went on to form his own interpretation so that he could indoctrinate people with that interpretation of how he views Judaism. So all these rules, brainwashing people, indoctrinating people, forcing them to take illicit substances, abusing children, this whole sort of modesty process, we call it in Judaism sinut, which is, where he was making all these women and children wear this burqa, these black cloths. And he also developed a process where there was a lot of physical violence towards children and teenagers, towards women as well, some men within this cult. I remember myself, guys, discovering Lev Tahor actually several years ago, and the first images I saw of Lev Tahor on the TV was where they were being indicted, I think, by the FBI, and they were in Guatemala, which is one of the very prominent countries they were in. They've been in, as I said, many others, but this one is where a lot of different investigations ended up starting, and this is where people started to see how prolific this cult is. So basically in Guatemala, and this was very similar in other countries, but I feel like the situation when the cult was living in Guatemala was very extreme conditions compared to in the other countries. So in Guatemala, they were basically in the middle of nowhere, almost in like, I want to say like a kind of jungle essentially. So there was no civilization around that part where they were, and they constructed these kind of houses or huts, I want to say, like, and really, like, the conditions that they were in is very shocking. And they were just living in these kind of dirt hut houses, and children had fungus on their feet, and they had mattresses with urine soaked in them completely, and the children were in a complete state. They were really unkept and dirty because the adults didn't ever wash the children. I can't remember what illicit substances the cult leaders were giving to the members of the cult. I do remember that they were giving the substances more to women to kind of sedate them, really, so that they could control them more. And I don't know what they were, but they were quite strong illegal substances essentially, and they were getting the women to take these, and they then gained full control over them and their children. Now essentially what ended up happening is there were many cases of kidnappings, or what was referred to as kidnappings. So you got women who end up wanting to leave the cult, they don't want to be in it anymore, and by some miracle they've managed to escape out of this jungle rundown situation and get away with their kids. And these cult leaders, so there's Shlomo Helbrans, but there's all these other sort of mini rabbis under him, or what is termed as rabbis. I wouldn't call them rabbis because the way they behave is not how a rabbi should behave, but yeah, they were kind of mini rabbis under him. And these elders in the cult would go looking for these women with their children, even if they were in another country. So when this cult was based in Guatemala, for example, they would go to the US or Mexico to go and find these women with their children. And bear in mind, guys, that because these cult leaders have an extreme interpretation of what Judaism is, they are not bothered by police, FBI, or any legal authorities. They are only interested in what they believe is their version of Judaism, essentially, okay? So it so happened that these elders would then, as I said, go to these different countries to find these women with their kids, and they would then take back these children to the cult. So they weren't bothered too much about the women, they didn't really care, but they wanted the children back in the cult. So essentially they would take back these kids, and of course that is a breach legally. If a mother's left with a child, then, and you're not happy with that, you need to go to court and dispute it. You can't just go and take the child, because that forms a case of kidnapping, of course. But these cult elder leaders didn't care, because for them, they just believe that they're doing what they want to do, and that's right, and that's it. So these women who'd left then went to, like local police, etc. And this is how this cult really started to get heavily investigated. So anyway, the FBI and, police got involved, got the children back, and when they got the children back, these elders had to come to court as well, because obviously they'd done kidnapping cases, and they then started to get criminal records for this, because it's very serious. But they still didn't really care about this as such. There's still a case which there's videos about online now, about this boy that's around 13. So he'd just done his bar mitzvah, and his mother had actually put him in the cult because she didn't understand it's a cult, and she just thought it's a very like strict yeshiva, which is, as I said earlier, like a Jewish religious school for boys essentially. So she thought she was doing her best to put him there so that he could learn, at an in-depth level about Judaism and have good values and morals essentially, right? And anyway, she wanted to take her son back. She's like, he's done a year, he's done 2 years, I want to get my son back now. And they refused to give her child back. Anyway, what happened is that Shlomo Helbrans, he did like a video of this child, this teenager, saying that he was very happy to be in the cult, that he didn't want to return to his mother. And Shlomo Helbrans made him say this information. And I think by the time this went to court, he was like in his late teens. He was probably like around 18 or something like that. He was quite a bit older because it took time to get to court, you know. So what Shlomo Helbrans did is he gave this guy a bribe, and I think it wasn't even much. Maybe it was $5,000 or $7,000. It wasn't a huge amount of money actually, and he bribed him and said he'd give him this money if the boy essentially says that Shlomo Helbrans isn't holding him hostage. And that is what the boy did, because at that time he had so much kind of fear, and he had been brainwashed so much by this cult that he just went along with it. And years later, maybe like 10 years later or 8 years later, this same guy came out and said that he had been brainwashed by Shlomo Helbrans, that he'd been given this bribe of between $5,000 and $7,000 at the time, and so he felt obliged to go with it, especially because this cult is a very, very violent cult, and they would beat people like very heavily with like, you know, wooden planks and things like that. So this guy felt under, you know, pressure that he had to go along with what the cult leaders were telling him. But yeah, he came out years later and said that he'd lied and that he was forced to do this video essentially. There's also the case of a girl, and she was 17 years old and pregnant by force, and her brother, while she was heavily pregnant, beat her with a belt and a coat hanger, and her father had, you know, intimately, in brackets, abused her as well. And, you know, it honestly, it was horrific. And that girl, guys, was married by force at the age of 15 to someone, I believe, who was like 30, and then obviously she ended up pregnant and beaten. So all these sort of things started to come out about this cult, and one person that really raised the alarm heavily on this cult is Mendy Levy. And Mendy Levy is an amazing Jew. He's an amazing person. And he ran away when he was, I think, in his mid-teens. He managed to escape and get out. And obviously I can only imagine that would have taken a lot of strength and courage, especially at such a young age. But he knew that what they were doing wasn't right. And they used to beat him heavily, treat him appallingly. And he was one of the people that escaped from when they were based in Guatemala, living in this squalor, in these, you know, dilapidated huts in mud and urine and, you know, dirt essentially. Mendy has done different documentaries about his time in the cult and, you know, what they were doing, and he's been very open and honest about that, even potentially at his detriment, because these cult people are very dangerous. And then his brother, I think a year or two later, his younger brother managed to get out and leave as well, and he's called Yoel Levy, and he also then spoke out online about what the cult were doing. And this is where a lot more people, especially people that were using social media like myself, etc., this is where they started to really raise more the alarm on this cult heavily. And essentially what the cult elders would do is, after all these investigations started, they had to keep having all these court cases, etc. So they couldn't really just like, you know, like go about their business how they were before and sort of do what they want. And they would have like people that were like from welfare, like social workers, etc., just turning up on their doorstep when they didn't expect it, and then social workers would see the conditions the children are in, and then they would come and just take the children away. And obviously these cult leader people, there's nothing they could do, because, you know, these people are still from the authority, so, you know, they couldn't really stop them from taking the children still, but they were obviously really annoyed. So when the cult started out, it wasn't as extreme as it was by the time we hit like the late 2000s, for example, but it was still extreme, but not as extreme. So when the cult was in Israel, that was when it was founded. It was in its early days when Shlomo Helbrans obviously started it, and there wasn't all this level of violence and things going on, but his viewpoints that he had were already divisive with the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community, and so it wasn't really in accordance with what they thought. And also because Israel has a history of Zionism, which is, you know, an extreme political movement in Israel where they don't want anyone like apart from Jews in the country and all of this. Shlomo Helbrans actually wasn't in agreement and in accordance with that, and so there started to become this divide between him and like other rabbis and other Jewish communities and denominations. So essentially what happened is Shlomo Helbrans thought, do you know what, I'm going to take my cult elsewhere, because, you know, the rabbis here in Israel, they are trying to intervene too much in my business of running my cult, and I don't like that. So he decided to go to the US, so to the United States initially, and basically when something would happen, as in people started to interfere too much, like authorities, he would then skip that country and go to another. So he then went to, I believe, Canada, and then they hit Guatemala. And when they hit Canada, that is when the welfare and social workers and all that started really getting involved, and that's when the kidnapping situation was in the news a lot. And then they went to Guatemala, and this is where they were living in all that squalor, and again their profile sort of, you know, was all over the news and, you know, social media and everything, because people are like, how are these people living in these conditions? And it was very shocking to see the images. So after that, by the time they're in Guatemala, this is when the whole FBI investigations and this started, and this is when the sort of criminal situation, investigation, legal situation, blah blah blah, got more and more heavy, a lot more when they were, compared to when they were in Canada. So, you know, and then that's when Mendy Levy and his brother Yoel escaped, was when they were in Guatemala. And then a lot of other people started to escape from the cult at that time when it was in Guatemala. And so the profile of the cult was getting into disrepute more and more and more. They had all these like different court cases going on. There wasn't even one court case, it was like loads and loads and loads, because it was all different members of the cult that had left now filing lawsuits. And then you had social workers welfare involved, and then the FBI involved, because it became such a high profile case. And there was so much going on. So Shlomo Helbrans was like, right, it's time to skip the country again. So then he decided to go to Mexico. And then when, you know, that whole process started again, where they start getting investigated, then he went to Bosnia-Herzegovina, then he went to Montenegro, then Romania, then to Macedonia. So at this present day, the cult itself is still, I want to say, operational around Romania and Macedonia. Now, the thing is, guys, in between all of this going on, Shlomo Helbrans did go to prison for 2 years in the early 90s for one of these kidnappings. But then he came out after 2 years and he just started doing the same thing again. And it was more and more prolific. And that's when they then ended up in Canada, and then in Guatemala, and then Mexico, etc. And I think around the time that he did this initial kidnapping in the early 90s, that was when he was still sort of going between Israel and the US and all of this. And I believe that Israeli government actually wanted him extradited to Israel, because he didn't want to go back there, because he knew he's going to get locked up, because the Israeli government, when they go in for you, they go in for you. So they were going to finish him and throw away the key, basically. And he knew that, so he didn't want to get extradited there. So anyway, he ended up doing 2 years in prison, and then he's then gone from country to country and made the cult more and more prolific. Now, Shlomo Helbrans was doing what's called a ritual immersion in a river in 2017, so not that long ago, to be honest. And when we do ritual immersions in Judaism, guys, we do them in what's called a mikvah, and a mikvah is kind of like a mini swimming pool, and we use it for different times in Judaism, like different processes that we go through. So it could be when you're going through a conversion, it could be when a woman's at the end of a pregnancy, it can be also when a woman's just finished her period, like, and some men will go through go to the mikveh as well. So there's different reasons why the mikveh is used. So Shlomo Helbrans was probably trying to do this ritual immersion in a river with someone because they didn't have access to a mikveh. And normally, guys, the mikveh is within a synagogue. It's not in the open air. It's not, you don't go in a river and do like, and consider that it's a mikvah, because it's not even clean, right? So he was doing this kind of ritual immersion in some river in 2017 after all this stuff had been going on, and he actually drowned in the river. And then around the same time, there was, so this is when they were going from Guatemala to Mexico. In Mexico, there was an Israeli consulate. So, you know, in every country you've got like an embassy for that country. So like Israel has, at this time when I'm doing the video, Israel's got less embassies in other countries because of the Israel-Gaza situation, of course, but back then Israel had embassies in literally, you know, every country in the world. So there was a consulate and an embassy in Mexico, and now the cults arrived from Guatemala to Mexico. So because the FBI were involved in this, like it was a prolific case, they alerted this consulate in Mexico, this Israeli consulate. So then the Israeli consulate got involved to collaborate with, or corroborate with, the FBI and police to capture these individuals from the cult. And so through that operation that they put in place, they caught these 4 individuals, and they were like what I referred to earlier, guys, as these mini rabbis. So they were all working under Shlomo Helbrans, and then, you know, executing what his commands were. So, you know, of abusing people and this extreme violence and getting them to take illicit substances, and they were implementing all of this. So 4 of these men got arrested. So that was a how can I say this, like a good outcome to that FBI operation. Now, even though Shlomo Helbrans had drowned in 2017, and then literally almost straight after that 4 of the mini rabbis had been arrested, so the you know, all the cult leaders were starting to get arrested and disappear, and so there was less and less cult leaders, but there were people that obviously still believe Shlomo Helbrand's teachings, right? So by the time we hit around 2018, all of these people decided they're going to seek asylum in Iran, which is a Shia Muslim country, and they obviously have this extreme interpretation, you know, this cult does, of Judaism. So they started asking for asylum in Iran, and I believe it was rejected because the president at the time, I think it was Ali Khamenei, he rejected their asylum. Anyway, after their asylum was rejected in Iran, they then went to Kurdistan and were detained on the Iraqi border by officials, and they were then deported to Turkey. And from Turkey, these not the elders, these people that were left of the cult, they ended up going then from Turkey to Romania. And this is how, you know, this is the most recent sort of information that we have on this cult, is that they've been there, and that was around 2022 2023, so fairly recently. Now obviously you guys can see that this cult has moved around a lot, and obviously every time that they're moving, the reason why they're moving is because they're under these criminal FBI investigations in regards to their illicit activities. So they have to keep moving, and I'd say on average they're moving generally every 2 to 3 years. They move to another country, so it is, you know, it's a lot basically. Like generally you would not see other Jewish communities, for example, just constantly moving around, and if a Jewish community moves, it will go to another country where there is a substantial community of other Jews. It wouldn't just go to all these different random countries basically. But this is what this cult was doing, because it basically just wanted to go to countries where it could flee the FBI. Recent sightings of this cult are in North Macedonia, and that was around 2022, but it's believed that there are still active cult members now from this cult in Macedonia at this present time. In March of 2024, guys, so this is March of 2022, Shlomo Helbrans, I believe it's his son-in-law, so that was married to one of his daughters, Sarah, the one who ran away, who was excommunicated. He was sentenced, that son-in-law, to 12 years in prison in 2022, and another member, prolific member of the cult, was also sentenced at the same time as this guy. And then in March of 2024, so very, very recently, just a few months ago, 3 other very high profile male members of the cult were also sentenced to prison as well. So there's been a lot of different criminal processes going on for years and years and years. Bearing in mind this cult started in 1988 and we've still seen arrests in 2022 and in March 2024. Now, I'm really pleased to say, thank God, that some of the women who escaped from this cult or who were stuck in it and couldn't get out, and where all the children had been taken away, some of those mothers have been reunited with their babies or children, so they got them back after they got out of this horrific cult, so they were able to be together again, which is a miracle actually. So at least that's something good. I think I forgot to mention, guys, I always forget something, that this cult only has always had about 200 or 300 members. So again, in numbers it's a small cult, but in regards to what they're doing, they are very, very prolific. Anyway, guys, as always, I hope you found this video interesting, insightful, and once again I feel relieved that some of the children were reunited with their mothers, and that there are people who managed to get out of this cult and they rebuilt their lives as well, which is such a good thing, you know, and we send our prayers to them, of course. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you very, very soon, of course, for another one.